Let's talk about one of the biggest predictors of how people vote. It isn't just about the issues or the candidates. It's about who we are. Today, we're going to decode the American voter by looking at 5 presidential elections from 1996 all the way to 2012 to see how our identities, our gender, our race, our age really drew the political battle lines of an entire era.
It's the million-dollar question in politics, right? Is it the hot-button issues of the day, the charisma of a particular candidate, or maybe just the state of the economy? Well, sure, all that stuff absolutely matters, but the data from this period points to something, well, a little more fundamental, something that's almost baked into our demographic DNA.
And this quote just nails it. The American electorate isn't one single giant group. It's actually this complex tapestry of different demographic groups. And as we're about to see, these groups create some really clear, really distinct dividing lines when it comes to their politics.
Okay, so to really get a handle on those dividing lines, let's start with the 30,000-foot view. Before we dive into specific groups, how did Americans as a whole identify politically during these 16 years?
What this chart shows us is pretty fascinating. If you look at the lines for Democrats and Republicans, you'll notice they're actually pretty stable. They kind of bob up and down by just a few points. But the real story, the place where all the action is that line for independents.
That 7-point jump is a really big deal. Why? Because it represents a growing slice of the country that isn't loyal to any one party. These are the swing voters, the people both sides are desperately trying to win over, and their rise made the political game a whole lot less predictable.
All right, with that bigger picture in mind, let's drill down into our first major demographic divide, the gender gap. It's probably one of the most talked about features of American politics, and this data shows it was an incredibly stable and persistent force during this time.
You can see it right here, plain as day. In every single one of these elections, women were more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate than men were. And of course, the opposite was true for men. They consistently preferred the Republican. Just look at 2012. 55% of women went for the Democrat, while 52% of men went for the Republican.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Underneath that stability, there's another story. Women's support for Democrats was rock solid, only moving about 5 points over 16 years. Men, on the other hand, were a lot more volatile. Their support for Republicans swung by 10 points. That's double the rate of women. It suggests they were more likely to shift their votes based on things like, say, the Iraq War.
So the gender gap was kind of like this steady, slow-moving current. But if you want to find the real political earthquakes of this period, you have to look at voting patterns based on race and ethnicity. That is where we see the most incredible transformations. And when I say dramatic, I am not kidding. Between 1996 and 2012, every single major racial and ethnic group saw a double-digit swing in how they voted. This wasn't just a small drift, this was a fundamental political realignment that literally reshaped the entire electoral map.
This chart lays out a pattern of increasing racial polarization. You've got non-Hispanic white voters generally supporting Republican candidates, while voters of color, Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters are largely supporting Democrats. And this divide only got deeper over the years, really intensified by things like Barack Obama's historic candidacy and some pretty intense debates over immigration.
95%. Just let that sink in for a second. In 2008, 95% of Black voters cast their ballot for Barack Obama. This solidified their position as one of the most reliable, most unified voting blocs for the Democratic Party, a true cornerstone of their entire coalition.
Now, the story of Asian voters during this time is maybe one of the most remarkable examples of political change you'll ever see. In just 16 years, they went from a group that actually gave more of their votes to the Republican ticket in '96 to a group that gave a nearly 3/4 majority to the Democrats in 2012. That is a massive, historic flip.
Okay, so at the same time this huge racial realignment is happening, another deep fracture was forming in the electorate, but this time it was splitting voters by age. The youngest and oldest Americans were basically heading in completely opposite political directions.
Just look at this side by side. It's like two different worlds. On the left, you see the youngest voters, ages 18 to 29, becoming more and more Democratic, peaking in 2008. But on the right, voters 65 and older were moving in the other direction, becoming more Republican, especially after 2004. They were on two totally different paths. So what was going on? What was pushing these two groups apart? Well, it was heavily influenced by the major events of the time. Younger Americans were really drawn to Barack Obama's message of change and were strongly against the Iraq War.
Meanwhile, some of those exact same things, like post-9/11 security concerns and Obama's barrier-breaking candidacy, pushed many older voters toward the Republican Party.
So, we've looked at the gender gap, the racial realignment, and the generational divide. Now let's pull all these threads together and really pinpoint the key patterns that define the American voter from 1996 to 2012.
If you had to sum up this whole era, it really comes down to four big things. You had a gender gap that was always there, a dramatic racial realignment, a growing divide between young and old, and of course, that steady rise of the independent voter. Together, these trends created a much more fluid and unpredictable political battlefield.
This whole analysis gives us a really clear snapshot of the forces that shaped a critical era in American politics. But it makes you wonder, right? Have these same lines faded away, or have they gotten even deeper? Or maybe they've been replaced by totally new ones. As we look at the political world today, what are the demographic divides that are going to define the next generation of American voters?